start recording now, and we'll start to present now. All right, just got to double check to make sure that we are up on Twitch, which it looks like we are. We're just about 3 o'clock, so yeah. All right, cool. Say hello to everybody, sir.
Hello, everybody.
All right, so we are the StatsBomb Live Podcast. On Thursdays, we are hopping in with friends of the podcast, and today we are very lucky to be able to host Oliver Bartlett. I don't want to give away too much of his career, although those of you who are interested can find very many details out on the internet. But it's pretty exciting. A lot of success over the years, a lot of interesting places that you've worked for, like really impressive individuals, and to some extent, you know, a bit of a cutting edge to some of the things that you've done. So yeah, thank you for coming on to the StatsBomb Live Podcast, and let's get started. So I have one important question that I was uncertain about because when did we meet? 2015, 16?
15, I think it was, yes.
Yeah. Are you English or Australian?
I like to claim both, and I'm English purely for the fact that I was born in London and lived there for the first year and a half of my life, and I have family in the UK.
I ask because Transfer Market has you down as London, and my head only knows you as Australian.
Yes, but actually quite a part of my growing up, especially the young years, I spent in Australia. So both are true, and I feel just at home in Australia as I do in London every time I step out of the plane.
Would have been more likely to be able to play for the Australian national team should that have been your interest. But I think you're going to tell us a little bit about how that was never even close to reality. So where did you get started, sir?
I failed that first hurdle just for the fact that there's not enough talent. But I was very keen in my youth and in sport, and had a limited career in track and field, and took that interest and that little bit of knowledge that I had and made a career out of it. I ended up starting to study biology, thinking that was a decent and honest job that I could do, but finding very quickly that
decent and honest job.
finding that I had way more interest in sport in my free time, also to the detriment of my studies. So I thought I might as well study what I'm busy with all my time anyway. And ended up applying and getting a place at the German sports university in Cologne, and got a sports degree there, and then traveled back to Australia to work in the sport industry. But finding that I had very little knowledge of injuries, so I was able to work with fit people. But as soon as they were injured, I had very limited knowledge of what was going on and how they were returning and what was happening whilst they were gone.
Okay.
So I came around to the idea that maybe I should go and actually have a look at what the people are studying, where they go to. So in the end effect, where they spend most of the time is a physiotherapist. And I sat back down to go through a physiotherapy degree, and came out of that with a lot of new knowledge, that the knowledge that I did not want to work as a physiotherapist, but that I had now knowledge of what was happening and going on with athletes, that I felt very capable of taking athletes from where they are in physiotherapy and rehabbing them all the way back to top level sport, and I did that in a sports rehab clinic in Germany.
So that's one thing that like people often sort of mistake. You know, it's not just that you're assessing the injury or the fitness or whatever. Like many times you're taking somebody back to some level of fitness, but peak fitness and the people that you would work with are very different animals to some extent than you would see like from normal the population. Like you're working with elite athletes, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit, because like the work that you've done with the coaches and the styles of play in particular mean that you might have different structure around the things that you have to do, and also like super different requirements than you might get just from your average physiotherapist or whatever. So you've been going to school off and on in Germany. You've got sort of this hybrid amount of degree in sport, but physiotherapy, combining it all together into fitness type stuff. Then what happens?
Two things happen, and then I got to meet a very interesting gentleman, a professor in physiology, who has a background in sport himself. And I continue to educate myself by learning the basic physiological reactions of what does training do, what do certain exercises do, what does it actually do on a cell level, and knowing what the reactions are and what you can influence and what you cannot influence, and taking that and building that back up to a way to be able to approach an athlete at any stage, whether they're injured, whether they're at the beginning, whether they're off season, in the middle of the season. If you know and you understand what the reaction is to the stress that you give them through training, through the exercises that you do, you can understand what will happen and when it will happen, and in what range that will affect them, and how long it will take to recover, etc. And that was very interesting because I was able to do that and apply it directly in various sports, because it was a multi-sport area that I was working in. So I had track and field athletes, I had basketball players, volleyball players, judoka, and that was very interesting and a great, for me, a great sandbox to practice in. And as is the case in Germany, there's football everywhere. So there were also football players there, and this was a town called Osnabrück. So there was a second division club, as it was at the time. And I got in contact with these players. And this is around 2015, 16. It's also parallel the time where
Jurgen Klopp comes
into the picture.
2005-6.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry, 5-6. Sorry. As I said, this is the time where Jurgen Klinsmann comes into the picture with the German national team, and he is bringing this area, this view, this focus on the physical side of football back into the picture, something that the Germans had always been known for. And he was pointing out that was actually not the case anymore. Even though they were proud of their physical fitness, they weren't actually the fittest anymore. So a fortunate coach at the time, Mr. Wollitz, who's the head coach of Osnabrück, always open for new things, jumped on this and said, well, if it's good enough for the national team, why don't we do this as well? And asked me whether I could do anything to help them. And naive as I was, I thought that sounds good. That sounds interesting.
Yeah, that's fun. I might as well.
I might as well. I'll jump into that. And basically have not left the world of football since then.
Okay. So you're working around the German national team, the time that, and it's kind of funny. Like the Germans seem to have like phases and cycles, and I guess everything has phases and cycles, but you go through a period where you realize that you're no longer among the truly elite in different ways. Then you bring in experts to then pump you up, and then you presumably succeed, and then there's always this sort of like tail plateau where things sort of get back into complacency, and then like somebody revolutionizes again. So that's kind of the Klinsmann era around that time.
Exactly. I got picked up and I made contact with what was at the time Athletes Performance, and had the opportunity to get in contact with the German national team through them, and after the success of the World Cup that they had, was able to join them by becoming one of the newly installed fitness coaches for the under 21 national team. And at the same time, players who had been in the German national team or who were in the German national team at the time, going, actually, we really like this. We feel different. We feel better. We have a feeling that this is actually something for us. So the optimal situation of player buy-in. And a player from Borussia Dortmund asking me whether I wouldn't be interested in doing rehab with him. And
Which player?
That's just. This was, and I'm very proud to have made his acquaintance. Very honored. Is Sebastian Kehl, who is now the one of the directors.
Yeah.
He championed me to come to Dortmund, and Michael Zorc being somebody smart to take a gamble and say, this guy has never been in football, doesn't have a big track record, but this sounds very good, and our players are interested, so let's do this. Let's give this a try, and that was 2008.
So this young kid on the. I say young kid. I guess like in comparison, it's not that young, but there's this kid up here in this yellow. And 2008, you go to Dortmund at the invite of Zorc, and you're working with players, and you've made some rapport with some of the national team players, which is a great start, obviously. And who did you go to work for there?
So this was a perfect setting, because it was Dortmund at the time was a new coach, a guy of the name of Jurgen Klopp, a young up and coming coach at the time, if you believe it, who said, let's do this. I like the physical side of football. I want to play an intensive game. I like the freshness, the new insight that you're bringing, and let's work together and give this a try. And I still had a few things to learn. That is, I had to learn to work in this team setting, to understand that obviously it goes about football, and football comes first, and I had to integrate myself into this world and still try and apply the knowledge that I had, and make it work and make it be successful in a Bundesliga setting.
And success definitely occurred here, which is also pretty cool, right? I think I look backwards. Was it something like did Dortmund finish 13th the year before you arrived? Something like that. You and Klopp, obviously.
That is correct.
That's wild. That doesn't seem like it should be possible.
No, and for me, it was a very nice setting, because obviously I was not looking at that. I was not afraid of that. I was not wondering anything about it. I was fresh and full of energy and ready to apply everything that I had learned in this setting. And looking back at it now, it seems to me more impossible than it maybe actually was at the time for me.
Well, German football back then actually was much more varied, and you would see teams move up and down the league table much more so than the last couple of years. I mean, even at one point, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but you guys kind of knocked Bayern off their perch, which they have not been knocked off for a very long time. So the first two seasons that Dortmund were there, they finished 5th, and then in 2010 and 11, you finished 1st, and then you did it again.
Yes,
and you won the league and cup double. So talk to me a little bit about the process, how things changed, and that 10-11 season, which was a decade ago now. What was that like? Because I was at Dortmund earlier this year, magnificent stadium, great atmosphere. I guess not this year, last year. To see, I got to see the Inter match, and that was electric. But so anyway, tuck into this time period, tuck into a little bit about the style, because I know that you hadn't worked that much outside of the German national team. You've worked some with football, but the style with Klopp is a pretty big deal, and someone has to enable that on the player side.
Yes, there's of course always a multitude of things that come together, and part of it is of course that the squad was turned around as one of your areas of expertise of knowing exactly that certain players fit to certain styles, and it was a question of putting a new team together and taking out those that weren't capable or weren't able or weren't willing to adapt to this. And that goes for the style of football, but also for the style of training. What I was doing, what we were doing together, what he wanted to see as a head coach on the field, and the interesting examples of players, young players. I remember that there was a player who was loaned out and was maybe to be returned, but just to be sold because actually he was too slow, even though he was a good footballer, as they were telling me. And my naive question was, well, why can't I work with that? Why can't, if you let me work with this guy, I'll show you what I can do, what we can do, how far we can get, and then maybe you should make a decision. And that's how naive I was at the time, but that is what I really believed and still believe, that is what you can do with players. Now, as most people know, you can't make somebody who's very slow very fast. But if you look at the player and the position and what he needs in the way of tools to be able to be successful on the field, then there are certain things that you can work with and can improve tremendously. And so Nuri Sahin, from being somebody who was maybe not ever going to have a career at Borussia Dortmund, we just sat down and we said, okay, what you need is first step acceleration, an ability to create just that little window, that step away from your opponent, to be able to bring your skills into play, like getting an excellent pass downfield.
And that's like one thing that people also don't quite realize, like footballers come from all over the place, and they haven't always had the best training, whether that's from a tactical perspective or from a coaching perspective, or even from a fitness perspective. And especially with young players, if you look at them and you say, okay, if we get like another 12 months with this kid and we're able to put him through the right program, we can up his potential fitness output and physical output by like 10 to 15%. That actually is the difference between sort of an average player and the elite. And that's a huge impact on guys that these days, cost 50 to 100 million.
And it's an absolute win-win situation for everybody involved. If it works, it's excellent. The player gets to have that career, the club gets to profit from it, the team gets to profit from how he can play, and the fans get to see more spectacular football. There's no question that football is talent driven, but everything that you can do around this talent to make them physically better will help to make it more interesting and a better career for everybody involved.
So you worked with some pretty special players, I think it's fair to say. One guy that scored the goal that won a World Cup. Another one that seems to be basically the best center forward in the world right now. Quite a few other ones that have had amazing careers. Do you have a particular favorite? I know it's been a while, so I feel like we might be able to cover this and not get you in trouble.
I have to say that I look back with fondness at this team and great young players with great buy-in into what we were doing with them, and a real keenness to apply this and getting positive feedback, obviously through being successful, and then continuing to try and continue down this line and improve even more. And it is without question that one of the reasons, for instance, Lewandowski is the player that he is that he was definitely talented. He was physically also very good, but he was not afraid to work on himself to make himself a better athlete, a better player, and he hasn't stopped.
He was actually more full featured with you guys at Dortmund in that he could play make as well. And
Yeah,
you look at his output there, like he's setting up teammates for assists and stuff like that. Now he's viewed more as a pure goal scorer that can fit into elite sort of possession teams. But back then he did absolutely everything.
yeah, yeah, and it was definitely something that was wanted. It was there was a time where he was not the regular player, but the situation came around, and he took exactly what was asked of him and made the best of it, and that is definitely what you need to have a successful team.
So Jurgen Klopp, and this is probably one of my favorite characterizations in football. Period. There are two amazing things that kind of came out of this era. One is the characterization of that style of football as rock and roll football, which I love because it feels correct, and I don't think his current style is quite the same. Obviously, very successful, but it's, not quite the same as what they do at Liverpool right now. And the other thing was talking about a little bit about gegenpressing being the best playmaker in the world. It takes a particular style and a particular fitness regime to actually enable those players to do that, to play that style of play. Talk to me a little bit about what you had to do and learn to get these players. Like, what are the KPIs you've got to work around? What are you really trying to develop with these guys, and how might that differ from what everybody else does in football every day of the week?
There's a very interesting thing that happened at the time, and something that gave me a feedback and indication of that I was on the right track. And the team gets tested by an external company, or a university in this case, and for us, at Borussia Dortmund at the time, it was the physician and professor of the university in Saarbrücken, also from the German national team, Tim Meyer. And so we got our regular physical testing done by them. And I got an email, a correspondence coming back and asking me what was I actually doing there, because they had seen something in the data which they had not seen in the rest of the Bundesliga until that point, and that was that the level of fitness, that the physical level was so unanimously high that there wasn't high peaks, and some players with very high peaks, and some players who were not so fit, but that the whole level was so high. And that was actually something that I had tried to implement with this team, and for the fact that when you analyze the way that Jurgen Klopp wanted to play football at Borussia Dortmund at the time, was that every player was able to get physically involved, move up the field, move down the field. And for that, you need to have centre backs, wingers, all positions at a very high physical level. So that was actually something that we were planning and working towards with the whole team. So for a centre back, we were doing quite a bit of running. We were doing quite a few acceleration drills, and that is maybe something not every team, definitely at the time, not every team was doing, but it's definitely something that we were specifically working on, and was very specific just for the style that he wanted to play.
So I mean, that style kind of a bit like, so tiki taka was very much in vogue during this era, and part of it's because Barcelona being possibly the best ever club team at the time, Pep's style was considered to be the thing. You guys are not that style at all. That style is not the same thing.
The opposite.
But I think what happened was those teams got beaten enough and soundly enough by often the German teams, including a Bayern team that didn't look that dissimilar to you when, as they came a couple years after you won the double. So like this is the precursor toward the more modern style, I think. And you guys were really the ones that seemed to be, not only pioneering it, but executing it at the elite level. And I always find that like really interesting. But so one of the things I wanted to mention here in the piece, the little clip that I've got on the screen here for those of you who are following the live is basically something had changed. Injuries mounting for years until only 3 Dortmund players came through the last campaign at full fitness, and Klopp's squad suffered a ton of injuries to different players as they flirted with disaster. The argument essentially is that Klopp's style of high-energy football places too much demand on players' bodies until they eventually break down. But that didn't happen when you were around. I don't know, causation, correlation, there's some disconnect there, but clearly, you want to make players as fit as they can be, but there are limits to that. And when you go over those limits, when you stretch those limits, then you end up with injuries.
That is definitely true, and it's, for me, it's difficult to say what happened, or as you said, what are the reasons for things to happen, and this, because you don't have insight, obviously, into what somebody else is doing.
It's not your fault. It's not your problem.
Yeah, although I do always, my heart bleeds for players that I have worked with who then get injured and cannot perform to the level that I know that they're capable of. But the situation is just that you need to be very specific in the way that you as a performance coach work with the team that has to fit with what the coach actually wants on the field. If that is not molded, if that's not made specific to fit, then you are going to end up with problems, because either you're doing too much or too little, or you're doing the wrong things. And it doesn't just go about the actual make him faster, make him be able to run more. It also goes about the injury prevention, the prehab kind of exercises that you do, the regime that you have around it, the amount of time that a player needs to spend with that. And obviously, the more intense the style is, the more specific you have to be with that. And that is what I have for myself always thought is what you have to do, what you need to be very conscientious with to be successful.
And it takes a lot of trust there. Like, it's another thing that people don't always understand. Like the trust factor in what you're telling the coach versus like what they need to do, right? They have. There's always going to be some injuries, regardless of how well you baby these guys. There will be some sort of injury, but you are basically saying, hey, we've got to pull this guy back a little bit, because otherwise we might lose him for the rest of the season, or like, he'll pick up a thing or whatever. But at the end of the day, the coach is the one that makes those choices, and that relationship is hugely important.
Absolutely, and you have to be aware of who you are and what your position is in this whole decision-making process, and the best that you can do is to realize that you are not going to be able to prevent every injury that there is. It is a sport like any other sport where you're trying to perform at the edge of what is possible, and you need to do that, which I think is rather unique in football, over a very long period of time. And you need to factor that in. You need to accept that some injuries will happen and some injuries are not preventable. I remember a very nice quote. I think you put it out on Twitter at some time, that you can do your very, very best and make sure that he gets exactly the right amount of training. But the moment that this player leaves the door from the performance center, he's out of your hands, and you need to trust that he is not going to go somewhere and do something to completely muck it up.
Sure, I often feel
but
bad
that
for
is real
players.
life. That can happen.
Yeah, exactly. I often feel bad for players like that, depending on their educational background, they won't necessarily know that much about how to take care of themselves outside of what they've learned. Plenty of, say, third division or second division clubs like don't have the expertise or the oversight to like keep these kids in great shape, or like to teach them all the things that they might know about how to run themselves at the elite level. It's one of the nice parts about being at Dortmund. Like, there's a lot of help and a lot of education that happens with these players to their parents as well, the young players and stuff. But yeah, at the end of the day, if they're going out and they're working with their own personal fitness trainer above and beyond what you've done, they're probably going to break, because you're already trying to stretch that limit.
Yeah. And that is part of your job. The, it's not just the buy-in that you need. It's the explanation, the education that you need to bring to these players, that you need to give, and it needs the honesty. They are all professionals working for themselves, obviously working for their own career. It's for just about all of them. It's a huge financial deal of what happens. So they're obviously their idea is obviously to do the best, but sometimes it needs to be guided. And if you can be honest and say, look, if you want to go somewhere, you want to do something, let's coordinate it, then normally you get a better buy-in, better return than if you're trying to go head to head.
Well, and that's part of your career path as well. I think that one of the unique things about you have an A license in coaching, correct?
That is not quite correct. That is a myth. I don't know where it comes
I'm
from.
sorry. See, this is my research. It's lying to me here.
I have been very careful to stay on the side of performance coaching. As much as I have interest in the actual football side, and I have learned over these years what different styles mean, and this is an educational process for myself as well, because it helps me understand what I have to do and how I can better apply my knowledge to what is supposed to happen on the field. But I don't want to interfere with that side of football. I don't
I
want to
totally understand, and that avoids conflicts of
be making
interest.
those decisions just for the fact that I think we should be doing something differently. That is not my job, but I do strive to understand it as best as I can, including your field of speciality, the whole data side, which I find fascinating
So before we move
and
to
very
that,
helpful.
I have one quick question. Do you have a favorite memory from that double season?
There are quite a few that I have, and just knowing at the end of that year where we win the double, that I'm going away with having finished this so successfully, and for the first time being able to step back and go, my goodness, what has happened? It's been 4 years, and what have I done, and what have what have we been able to achieve by working like this together? It felt like a fairy tale. I still think it is, but it's a wonderful story to be able to tell.
All right. So for those of you just joining us on the live pod, we're here with Oliver Bartlett, formerly of the German national team Borussia Dortmund. Next, we're going to move into the Red Bull period. So Red Bull Salzburg. You go from
Yes.
Dortmund, you make the leap to the energy drink.
Yes.
What prompted that, and how did that transition happen?
The transition is another leap of faith. Basically, my wife is Dutch, and we decided to move back to the Netherlands. And I was not sure. I'd never done this before. I'd never transferred from one club to the other. This was a first, and I uh, I was very happy that the former head scout of Borussia Dortmund said, there's a very interesting guy in his coach in Salzburg, and I think he might benefit from the knowledge that you have of the style of football and the training. And he's an interesting guy, and he's looking for somebody. So they were nice enough and kind enough to fly me down to Salzburg, and had a very good meeting. Not really knowing a lot about him yet, other than that there were one or two headlines in the paper from the previous season, but just having a very good feeling of the way that he could communicate what he wanted to do, what he wanted to achieve football wise, and I have to say a very professional setting provided by Red Bull. So I signed up, little knowing what was going to come.
And what year did you start there?
This was from 2013 to 2014. I was there.
Right, and that season apparently went pretty well.
That went beyond expectations.
So
I have to say,
to fill everybody in on this one, won the league by 18 points. Like Salzburg were not quite the powerhouse that we think of them, the perennial powerhouse that they are now. Plus 75 goal difference in a small league, which is insane. The second team was plus 23. But I think the moment that you guys really came to the attention of like the people that pay a lot of attention, I would say the football hipster world, but also the gambling world, was there was this winter friendly against a small team named Bayern Munich. And that small team got the crap kicked out of them. And they were coached by some guy named Josep Guardiola.
Yes,
that was pretty interesting because you don't often see a Pep team lose 3-0, even in a friendly. Like that doesn't happen.
No, that was a very interesting moment where we were 1 or 2 weeks back into pre-season training. There's a fairly long break in Austria, obviously, for the winter, and Bayern Munich was 1 week out from returning to season, and this was basically their final test match before playing again in the league. And obviously Salzburg being close by Munich, and there being some relation between the owner of Red Bull and Bayern Munich, that's how this game came about. And it's a really nice feeling of being the underdog, but knowing that it is not quite as much the case as everybody else might be thinking. So going into a game knowing that it might just be a little different than is expected.
And that definitely happened. And so like everybody perked up when that score came across, and you're like, wow, we should probably pay attention to these guys. And if you worked in gambling, like you're probably paying a little more attention to Salzburg anyway, but that's a really unexpected result. But that, it's not a one-off, because you guys followed up with an absolute destruction of Ajax in the Europa League knockout stages.
Yeah, the quote I remember from the Bayern Munich game was Guardiola coming up and saying, "Thank you very much for this lesson." And that was I think the first step for him to think about how to play against a team that is really trying to press the hell out of you, and taking that serious, and thinking of measures as to be able to succeed against that, and then doing the same in the EuroLeague in here in Amsterdam in a big setting, where I had the fortune of being able to read the Dutch newspapers and the Dutch headlines, and hearing from my wife what was happening in Amsterdam at Ajax, whilst we were traveling as Salzburg to Amsterdam to play them. And that was a fascinating game, because by that time we were quite confident that that was something that we were going to win, as opposed to
And
maybe the
it was like
media at the
6-1,
time.
right? Like the two-legged tie, you guys won, like scored 3 in each, and then they scored 1.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty comprehensive, I would say.
That's comprehensive, and for us it was very clear from the analysis of how Ajax was playing at the time that that was going to be somewhere around the result that was going to happen because we had answers to any possible situation that was going to arise.
Yeah, that style of play against that type of team that's like heavy possession, but also potentially wants to kind of man mark in their press, which is the Dutch style that was pretty common at that time in the elite style.
Yeah.
So we got 2 pictures up here on the screen. One of them is you hugging. Is that Jonathan? Jonathan Soriano?
That's Jonathan Soriano. That's the one thing one always has to remember, or should never forget. Obviously, that team at Salzburg at the time was a really interesting combination, and one has to maybe go back a little bit also to Rolf Rangnick and say the fact that he was the sporting director at the time at Salzburg obviously also makes a big difference, because he had the ability to just go, we're going to get this player, we're going to get this player, and we're going to get this player, and we had a quantity of players out of which we were able to pick then players that were very suitable to what we wanted to do.
Yeah, and they've built an amazing pipeline, and so the
Exactly,
talent the talent that you had on that squad included Kevin Campbell, Jonathan Soriano, who definitely could have played at the Champions League level in the bigs, but
Fantastic
somehow did
player,
not.
yeah.
Amazing dead ball striker as well. You had some guy named Sadio Mane, is that correct?
Yes, I understand that he's become quite a big player in the Premier League.
And who's this poor bastard in the cold pool right here on the pitch?
That's Isaac Forza. Really nice guy. But this was in the winter training camp where we went. But the situation was just that we managed to make it a great atmosphere, great buy-in from all the players. Sadio, fantastic person, fantastic football player, and making them all come together and having them all at the level that they needed to be at to physically be able to play what we wanted to play, and then seeing it work out like this, that was a fantastic year.
And this is about the time that you started to come across data people.
Yes. Little did I know about this level of data. As a world, as I know it now, it was unknown to me at the time. But I got contacted by a gentleman named Matthew Benham. Don't know whether that says anything to you.
Yeah, I've heard of him.
But and very interesting, and me realizing at the time, hey, there's something else going on here, and I want to learn more about this and know more about this, and want to see how that can help us and how that can help me in my area of expertise, and just be very excited at the fact that first of all, things like this, which might not be seen so quickly, were obviously there were people out there who could see this and were following this and then trying to go and find out how come they know this and how come they are interested in this. So that was very interesting, very exciting time.
Yeah, and you've continued to be interested, and that's one of the reasons why we keep talking. So you have the amazing season in Salzburg, and then that brings Roger Schmidt and yourself to the attention of Bayer Leverkusen, where you go, and I think you finished 4th in the first season, and then 3rd and 3rd in your Champions League group in 15-16, in one of the weirdest sort of tables that I can remember seeing.
Yes.
Roma -5.
Very interesting 2 years there.
And then 16-17, some things started to fall apart. We're going to skip over that for various reasons. But I think what happened in that 15-16, 16-17, like we started talking pretty regularly, and we started talking about like the difficulties of recruiting players for a particular style. And I think that is actually like a great lead into the Leverkusen period, but especially into China, which is what came next.
Exactly. I find the time I've spent in football fascinating, because once you think you have learned something and achieved something, then you make another step, and there's a whole new field to learn, a whole new area of which you can apply your empty mind to, and go, I need to fill my brain with this, and learn more about this. And it's as we said, the players that fit certain styles, and that you want to have might not get, or you get other players, and how do you work around that? That really then came together when we went to China, where there are obviously some stipulations, some rules in the Chinese league, which make that a very specific problem to your day-to-day work.
Yeah, so I played a little bit of attention to China prior to your moving there and Roger's moving there, and following it from afar, and like the giant deals that are happening, everything like that. And what was really interesting was to see when you guys arrived. Basically, a couple of the big clubs had been able to get a jump on this, and kind of pulled up the drawbridge behind them. You want to fill me in, or fill everybody else in a little bit on what you told me, and what Evergrande and Shanghai were able to do?
When we came, and we said, what is the possibility of transferring players, obviously with the knowledge that we had, knowing that we needed certain style of players, and certain physical capabilities as well, which is also something that I look at when I have the opportunity, or I get asked, and I think it's still a field which can be developed quite a bit more, is to say, what is he capable of, and what are the physical limitations here? How do we view this player from a physical side, but also from the style of playing? And we found that actually all the good players, and if you look at the squads, most of the national team players were actually in one club, and the Chinese market being very much a market of, if the owner doesn't want to sell the player, you're not going to get him. So you had to start digging and looking for those maybe B-rated players, or players that had some kind of defect, or were sidelined somewhere, and try and put together a squad where you had the idea that they might have potential to do what you actually want, even though they might not have fitted in the bigger picture of football as such.
And you
In
guys,
general.
So one of the things that seemed like a consistent thing with your career is you've often worked with younger players and been able to build their fitness, and the coaches that you're with build their skill sets, etc. I think you told me, or I read somewhere else, that just before the season that you guys moved, one of the, or two of the big clubs bought up like all of the best U23 players in China. And, yeah. and then there were limitations on like whether those players could move and how many could go in and out per season, which I don't want to say feels a little bit cheaty, but it's not like you're on a level playing field here.
It made for us it made it a unique challenge, because obviously every club was scrambling for under 23 players. Interesting for you guys, I'm sure, because it drives up the price insanely of under 23 players, because you needed 4 in your squad, you needed 3 on the team,
and they had to be good enough to play.
You needed to start one, and all 3 of them had to have playing minutes at the end of the game. Otherwise, you defaulted and lost the game.
Yeah, that's
so it became very interesting to follow the different tactics of the different teams, of apart from obviously from the one team that had all the top under 23 players, what everybody else was doing, and what type of player they were getting, and which position they were playing them in, and how many minutes that there would be the teams that would start with this one player and take him out after 5 minutes, and then put an older player in, and then try and change the other 2 at the other end of the game.
So even
there were all kinds of tactics there. Yeah.
Even with this playing field sort of slanted in the way that it is, you guys had success. So like first season, appointed mid-season, finished 9th. I think one of the issues you definitely said was that guys were slow, and obviously in Roger's style of play. Oh, I think I talked about the Klopp thing and it's rock and roll football. I think that the Schmidt style of play, at least before or at the start of when you go there, that one's more heavy metal. It's like a degree above and beyond what you guys were doing at Dortmund, and the Chinese, unfortunately, at least in the first season or something, cannot play heavy metal.
No, and I like the musical comparisons because if there's two things you don't hear a lot in the locker room or in the gym is rock and roll or heavy
A
metal
lot of hip hop
from young players. But it's a very fair comparison, and the interesting thing is that despite both of them being sort of pressing styles, physically harder styles to play, there are big differences in the philosophy and in the way that it is applied on the field, but also in training. And that means that working for Jurgen Klopp was a very different experience than working for Roger Schmidt. Roger Schmidt being very different in the way that he sets up training, certain styles of training, or certain exercises, I should say. And that means that the intensity for when we were playing was higher, but we played that strategically more in spurts of high power, high power, high power, being smart in using breaks, being smart in using recovery periods, and making sure that as powerful as it looked, it was always manageable. So distances that you ran at high speed were shorter for sure than with Jurgen Klopp. So if you look at some of the physical data of what happened with teams with Jurgen Klopp, with to quote an irrelevant statistic, but to have an average of 120 kilometers for a team run, we never achieved that with Red Bull or with Leverkusen. The total mileage that we put on the field was much lower. But there were certain key things that we looked at in game data and which we obviously trained towards during the week that were much more interesting, and that was the amount, the speed, the energy that we put in for ball recovery, for moving forward, obviously in that moment of possession, gaining possession.
And so
that is where we wanted to lead.
Yeah, so you guys are changing the Chinese, but at the same time, the Chinese are changing like Roger's style and a little bit about how you're sort of training and coaching the players. And so 2018, you guys finished fourth, but you win the Chinese Super League Cup, which is a big deal. And then 2019, things are going gangbusters, and then football gets weird as it does. But tell me a little bit about how the style and the limitations forced the change. And in some ways you've said, you think it made Roger a better coach and also probably made you a better at your job as well.
Yes, it was an opportunity for us to understand that with the limitations that you have, it might be better to have a different style to fit to this. So if you're limited due to the fact that they have had no education, no career as such in physical training growing up, that you're going to be way more limited in what you can do with them now as they're adult players, and also technical levels of clean passing, ball possession, etc. But that you need to go, okay, if that is the case, then what is our next best approach? Keeping an attacking style, which is obviously what we like and we think is most successful, but minimizing the problems that you have from losing passes, losing possession, etc. So we had the idea that Roger Schmidt had the idea that if you have a lot of possession, but moving forward and try and keep that going forward, and keeping that high speed for ball recovery when you do lose, made us go from a team that very much liked to have less than half possession to being a team that regularly had 70-80% possession,
I think,
but was still an attacking team.
yeah, and like, it was really interesting to see the numbers change there. You guys
Yeah.
were one of the teams that I think you and Atletico that broke some statistics that we looked at. Where basically back at Leverkusen, you were one of only 2 teams ever, I think, to qualify for the Champions League that had like less than well, not ever, but in our data era, less than 50% possession. And I guess the early teams with Klopp also didn't necessarily have that much possession because that wasn't something that was super interesting to them. So anyway, do you have like one good China story that like, you know, is something you can relate to everybody else?
A good China story that I can tell.
Yeah, just one that you can tell that we're not going to.
What I have to say that I very much enjoyed and the atmosphere that we had at the stadium in Beijing, and an old Mao era stadium, worker stadium, aptly named, and a stadium which is still in the center of Beijing, and having shops all around, people living all around, and having a stadium in the middle of the city where everybody just walks in and comes to the game, and having a very high number of regular people coming to the game was fantastic. I hadn't expected that I don't know why, but just hadn't expected that, and really enjoying that time in China, and having learned something new again, even though you might have been going to a league where you thought might not be the same level, but ending up learning new things and more experience in football, which obviously is something that I would like to take along and apply for my next step.
Yeah, so you have like this amazing background, and you've met with success almost everywhere that you've been, and you worked with some amazing talent. Like, what's next?
That is something that I'm looking into right now. Obviously,
So, are you a free agent? Are you on a Bosman?
I'm on a Bosman as it is, and the thing that, like for most of us now, that has just made everything grind to a halt is obviously COVID. It's the pandemic, which has put everything on ice. But I very much look forward to wherever it takes me next, because that is actually what I'm looking for. What is going to be coming up somewhere down the line, to see what it is. Interesting people that I've met along the line, and
Awesome.
interested to see where it's going to take me, because it's I have to say, I haven't regretted a moment of joining football and going down this road.
Well, you have an amazing resume, and I want to say thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us and fill us in. I know that I could talk to you about Chinese stories if we were allowed for like another hour on top of this.
It was obvious that I was not going to put any of those stories out online.
It's not my fault. Don't blame me, everybody. No, so this is Oliver Bartlett. Has won the Bundesliga, has coached in the Champions League, has won the Chinese Superliga Cup, finished second last year, almost unusually, or at least you guys were in second when football happened. Anyway, he is a free agent right now. If you're interested in getting in touch with him, how do they get in touch with you, Oliver? You have an agent?
It's very easy. It's obviously, I'm sure if they contact you,
I'm your agent.
They will get through to me, and otherwise, I'm easily reachable via email, which is just my name, oliver.bartlett@me.com.
Awesome.
And you'll find me.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time, and good luck on your next steps. And that wraps us for today's special guest star podcast on the StatsBomb podcast. Tune in on Tuesday at 3 p.m. UK time, and you will listen to myself and James York blabble about whatever again. And thanks for listening. Take care. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.